The shape and size of these fuel tanks, the Brisbane tank, was unique to the Thunderbolt. It was not used by any other aircraft. They tried bolting them onto Lightnings and it did not work. So the first combat mission was initiated on the 16th of August 1943. And this was escorting C-47s to an airfield called Marillinen, or Silly Silly, which General Kenny, he didn't like the name. In fact, Silly Silly and Marillinen are actually 5 nautical miles apart. I've walked the airfield, it's still there. It's if you ever get a chance, fly to Lay and get a truck, PMV, and it's still all laid bare. The only thing there now is a missionary church and school, but the airfield system is still there with the revetments built into the side of the hills. This mission of 16 August 43 introduced the next complexity in the theatre, and it went like this. I don't think any of you have heard of this, but the Lightning pilots up until that juncture had been fighting, the only Japanese fighters they'd been fighting were radial engine aircraft, because the KI-61 or the Hien or the Tony was really not that common. So anything, any combat experience that Lightning pilots had was against either Hayabusa or Japanese Zeros. So they had radial engines on them. So the next problem that arose was Thunderbolts were getting attacked by Lightnings quite a lot in combat, and it's more common than you think, and it was dangerous, and yes, lives were lost. So a good example occurred on 10th of October. A 348 Fighter Group pilot, Second Lieutenant Adrian McKeldin, was shot down by a flight of 3 Lightnings. This caused a lot of animosity back at Port Moresby. The Thunderbolt pilots started calling the Lightning pilots, the Lightnings, they called them egg beaters. So it was a source of great animosity. But at the time, even though they knew that they'd opened fire on the Thunderbolts, McKeldin's death was not attributed to the Lightning gunfire, and the command suspected it but couldn't prove it, kept it very quiet. They found out later on when they examined the wreckage it was definitely 50 cal. So it was definitely a Lightning shoot down. So this meant where possible, you've now got mission planners in Port Moresby. So what they're trying to do is separate Lightnings from Thunderbolts in the first few months of the war on joint patrols, because this is a great risk. Aircraft recognition of the times was really, really poor. And I'm talking about both sides. You get all sorts of mismatches and misidentifications everywhere. They're ubiquitous by both sides, including especially the Japanese, who still believed up until mid-43 that the Allies were operating Wellington bombers out of Port Moresby. So, okay, so feelings ran high between the two types of pilots, the Thunderbolt and Lightning pilots, bearing in mind the only reason the Thunderbolt was sent to New Guinea was that when Kenny went over to appeal to Hap Arnold for Lightnings, they were all being siphoned off to European theatre, so Arnold offered him the Thunderbolt and Kenny took it as a quote-unquote interim measure. Right, now, when the Thunderbolt arrived, even though it's big, beautiful and heavy, as Trump would have called it, a big, beautiful Thunderbolt, there were numerous and varied minor modifications were made to the airframe, to the weapon systems, the fuel systems, and the electronics. As such they were. These were not universal and they varied from squadron to squadron, but I'll give you an example. Some of the units fitted an extra antenna mount on the rear fuselage to increase VHF radio reception. The 9th Fighter Squadron elevated the gun sight by 2 inches because Gerald Johnson, their commanding officer, was a short ass. They cut doors into the rear fuselage to access the plumbing to the intercooler. That was very, very difficult to access. And the final major modification was the electrical releases to jettison the wing tanks. And this involved, by the way, also modifications to the solenoid system. For those of you who are aircraft engineers, you'll understand that heavy rainfall, when it gets into electrical systems, and especially solenoids, can short circuit them, which gave rise to another common problem, which was gun failure. So you could get someone in combat, press the trigger, and only one machine gun out of 8 would fire. That was usually a solenoid short circuit caused by high levels of vapor or rain. So the type's heavy weight, I'll come back to that too. Told you how heavy it was. This meant that tyre blowouts were very, very common, and especially on landing. And that was a dangerous time to have a tyre blowout. And it was the main cause of ground accidents, and not many were fatal because the Jug was nicknamed for the aircraft, was very, very robust. But the other main common thing was the blowout of the tail wheel tyre, and that caused a real problem because within the first 6 weeks of combat, the 348 Fighter Group had used up all their tail wheel tyres, and they had to run a special courier down to Australia to pick some up. One ingenious squadron, the 341st, because of the tyre blowouts, they invented an electrical system to pre-spin the tyres before landing, as you'll see on jet aircraft today. And I've looked at the system; it's quite ingenious. It didn't always work, but yes, it stopped the blowouts. The main introduction to combat was complicated by the fact that the general perception by other 5th Air Force pilots was that the Thunderbolt was a poor cousin to the 38. That's how they saw it, because they knew it was an interim measure, etc., etc. And what this meant was that 5th Fighter Command initially only gave quite benign assignments to the Thunderbolt units. That meant transport escorts or missions like that. So direct combat missions were not assigned for the first couple of months. Then they branched into bombing escorts, and then as the campaign against WWII heated up, they became more and more involved in that. Where's Pete? How much time have I got? Yeah? I can talk all night, that's the trouble. I'm deep in the moment, right in the records of the 4th Air Army, which recently got hold in the last few months, and there's some incredible stuff in there, including commentary by Japanese pilots on Thunderbolt performance, which I'll come to in a minute. So this is where the legend now of Neil Kirby, the commanding officer of 348 Fighter Group, began, because Kirby was he was an exceptional pilot. He was reluctantly put into 5th Fighter Command. He was sidelined as commanding officer because Kenny wanted his skills leading men rather than flying combat, but Kirby would quite often sneak out and take his Thunderbolt, but with him he would take the most talented Thunderbolt pilots in Papua New Guinea, which regularly included people like Sam Blair. So even though Kirby was put into a desk job, flying a desk, he was not happy with that, and he took every opportunity he could to get out and fly combat. And he developed unique tactics for the Thunderbolt. So he tailored the Thunderbolt to suit its strengths, and he emphasized that pilots should never break the strict rules of engagement which he set down. And above all, and I underline this and I keep underlining this, never ever engage the enemy when you are in a low energy state. What that means is you've got low airspeed, you're low, you're slow, you'll get picked off. And the Japanese were good at that. Superior Japanese maneuverability proved lethal right up until the end of 1943. So when we go back and look at the actual combat records, we realize that the Thunderbolt was really fighting Japanese fighters on a 1-to-1 ratio. There was no great advantage there. The Japanese tactics were to engage and get the Thunderbolt low and get it low and slow. So Kirby's tactics were very simple. Approach WWII as high as you could, normally between 23 to 27,000 feet, bearing in mind they're on oxygen. They'd hopefully find Japanese fighters in the circuit area or bombers, and then they'd swoop through them at speeds approaching 500-600 kilometers an hour, take a burst, and then get the hell out of the place. They would not fight the Japanese fighters. And I'll end this on how Kirby was shot down. It's quite a story. But Kirby emphasized to his pilots, these are the rules. You live to fight another day. You are not to dogfight Japanese fighters. They thought they were zeros, but they weren't. So, however, the main losses for the 348 Fighter Group, which is held up as the premier combat unit in the Pacific for the Thunderbolt. It had its first combat loss on 22nd of October 43, combat fatality that is. But by the time it left New Guinea, and that was just only 7 months later, it had lost 51 Thunderbolts to operational and weather accidents, which is much, much more than the Japanese shot down. So what I've done tables on this. So you can see, here's the summary, and the facts prove this. In the Southwest Pacific area, the Thunderbolt pilot was 5 times more likely to lose his life to weather or landing or takeoff accident than Japanese fighters. And that fact is published nowhere or admitted nowhere in any combat history I've read. I've got all the data, I've compiled all the tables, I've got every accident, so I'm on firm ground here. After the 348th Fighter Group, it's now, we come to late 43, early 44. It's fully engaged in combat. A new Thunderbolt unit arrived from the States. It was a fresh unit, the 58th Fighter Group. It was the last, or the second, but last Thunderbolt unit to arrive in New Guinea before the transition to the Lightning generally took over, even though it went on to the Philippines, and I'll explain that soon. So the Thunderbolts of the 58th Fighter Group flew their first combat mission, which was an escort mission, very benign mission, on the 2nd of February 44. On that mission, a few of the pilots bugged out for no good reason that I can see anywhere. Probably how would you term it in those days? A lack of moral fibre. We're not sure, but the first missions, escort missions, went very badly. The pilots were not flying them. They were diverting. They were putting down. They were using any excuse to get out of it. 5th Fighter Command came down on this like a ton of bricks and lined up the commanding officer and said, "You're not to fly combat until you sort out your pilots." So again, you won't read. I've never read this anywhere either. It's all in the official data, or in the official combat records, which are on microfilm. So the Republic Aircraft Corporation, which made the Thunderbolt in December 1943, they sent out civilian tech representatives to sell the Thunderbolt as a concept to the pilots at NADZAB. NADZAB at this stage is a burgeoning airbase, and a lot of these gatherings, they came close to blows, and the reason is the civilian advisors were telling them this is what you should do, and you get some guy down the back who's been in Japanese fighter sites 10 or 12 times, and he would stand up at the back and say, "No, that's not wrong, that won't work, I know, I've been there." And these meetings became really confrontational. So the other thing is that the Republic civilians were actually quoting test condition data. And of those of you who are engineers, I know you'll all understand there's a difference between test data and what actually happens in the field. So this was a curious side effect. Later in July 44, by the time the Thunderbolt had moved to the Philippines, into which, by the way, it was put into an attack role, a strike role, because at that stage the Lightning had become the predominant fighter. So civilian legend Charles Lindbergh made presentations on how to extend the Thunderbolt's range. And I'm sure all of you have heard of Lindbergh. He went out and did this series of lectures on, here's what you do. You increase your manifold pressure and you lower your RPM and all that sort of thing. Well, again, those meetings became quite confrontational because you've got pilots now have been flying this type in combat for years saying, well, that's nice, but I don't intend to do that in water in case I blow the manifold or blow the cylinders out. And the other thing they found with that was that it was later found by engineers when they were doing TBOs, time between overhauls, that the increased manifold pressure sustained long-term to the engine. Mainly it blew gudgeon pin bearings and it wore down piston rings disproportionately. So if you want a technical explanation later on the R2800, what did you come and talk to me? So Lindbergh's lectures, well-intentioned as they were, yes, he affected the P-38 pilots, the way they operated the Lightning, which you'll recall had an inline Allison V12, but it didn't touch combat settings for the Thunderbolt. The pilots kept doing what they had always done. Another thing with New Guinea, very humid air, very hot air. So that means low air density. That meant poor performance, particularly for a big radial which is not supercharged. So the hotter the air, the riskier the chances of having an accident on landing, because the stall characteristics of the Thunderbolt really came to the fore. When she stalled, it was quick, it was violent, it was heavy. Usually left wing down and bang, you're gone. And that killed quite a few people. Another one was that the stall characteristics were, and now I'm speaking as a paraglider pilot, for those of you who fly paragliders, there's a thing called rotor turbulence. So the Thunderbolt was disproportionately affected by rotor turbulence in thin air. And that killed quite a few pilots who thought they're on safe ground. A good example, the first accident here was 15 August 43. A guy called John Schrick lost control of a fighter at Moresby in minor rotor turbulence off the tops of gum trees at 7 Mile. The high wing loading the fighter in hot air meant it was a ground hog, especially if it was loaded up with extra fuel tanks. So that had to be watched as well. So in the end, it's operating out of mainstream airstrips like Finchhafen, which was upgraded, all of Port Moresby, of course, Nadzab, and even Goosap. Now, what have I got here? Right, here's an encounter. This is the 26th of December 43. This is the Cape Gloucester invasion, first day. And 8 248th Air Regiment Oscars engaged 16 Thunderbolts. And 2 of these were shot down without loss. Now, this is the Oscar fighter. And the Oscar fighter at this stage of the war is not what you think it is. It's been portrayed as a flimsy airframe with small weapons, etc. The later model KR-43 Series 2-Key series had armor plating. They had 12.8 millimeter machine cannon, as the Japanese called them. They didn't call them machine guns. And more to the point, 1 in every 3 rounds was an explosive round. So if you got hit by one of those, it usually went through the skin and either killed the pilot if it was in the cockpit area, or certainly took out the hydraulics. So the commanding officer of this unit, his surname is Muraoka. His first name is Shinichi. So Muraoka wrote, he said, when we met Thunderbolts, they immediately surrounded and separated us from protecting the bombers. They attacked from above. This is the high altitude thing. Outnumbering us 3 to 4 to 1, however, we lost no fighters. In conclusion, we did not lose. And 1 Hayabusa is the name given to the Japanese Oscar, and 1 Hayabusa, which failed to drop one of its fuel tanks, even survived. Here's Muraoka's conclusion after he encountered Thunderbolt for the first time. I am of the firm opinion that the Thunderbolt can be shot down if we take advantage of its mistakes. 4 enemy Thunderbolts only amount to 1 or 2 of our planes. So that's a curious assessment from Muraoka, who was very experienced pilot and commander. He was very old, by the way, for New Guinea combat. He was 28, which is almost unheard of for a combat pilot in New Guinea, but he was the commander of the regimental commander. So the let's see, so let's go back to, I'm recalling the 5th Fighter Command's reluctance to allow the 58th Fighter Group loose into combat. And they'd only been permitted to fly escort missions. So where's the date on this? 11th of April. First combat mission where they were actually allowed to fly the WWII. And it was conducted with the group commanding officer, Thomas Bullington, who led his pilots into combat. The 58th Fighter Group lost 3 Thunderbolts in that exchange. It was their first combat and they lost 3, including their commanding officer. And one of the pilots involved I don't have his first name. He was Sergeant Namei, and he recorded that the battle had been quote unquote one-sided in Japanese favour, which I think is quite interesting. The Thunderbolt enjoys the now for a few fun facts. It's the only fighter in New Guinea in which a female was killed. Occurred on 5th of May 1945 when Lieutenant Harold Wirtz from the Combat Replacement Training Centre at NADZAB took Miss Harriet Gowan, an American Red Cross nurse, for a joy flight in 8th Service Group P-47D. It failed to return. The wreckage wasn't found until 1996. It was a hole buried in the ground about 5 metres near NADZAB. So, look, here's my thesis: is that the reality is the Thunderbolt made little impact on the New Guinea Air War, and that's for a variety of reasons. Mainly, and most importantly, its limited range sidelined it from both the Rabaul and Hollandia campaigns. So the heavy lifting was done by the Lightnings. However, that said, they were deployed more regularly to WWII, including low-level strafe or escort, so they performed a vital service. Its first series of limited engagements, I've written here, achieved nowhere near the favourable kill ratios, which are still cited today. You'll hear, I don't know, Thunderbolts shot down 5 to 1 or whatever. It's about 1-on-1 against Japanese Air Army. The same claim as the Corsair, that they shot down 10 zeros for every Corsair lost. Well, it's actually not true. It's about 1-to-1. So the claims, Thunderbolt combat claims, and this is where I get into dangerous territory, but the reality is that the data which we've got now from the Air Army records, we prove that both sides, and I don't want to say that the Americans overclaimed, they did, but so did the Japanese. And in fact, the Japanese claims are slightly ahead of the American ones, but by and large, for 1943 over WWII, by and large, you can divide the average combat claim by about 4. For someone like Neil Kirby, who had a higher level of skill and gun cameras, I think he's credited with 22 victories. I'm not sure, but by my estimate, I think it's probably closer to 11 or 12, which, by the way, still is pretty good, because that's only 1 in every 2. So aerial opposition was all but wiped out in Papua New Guinea by March 44. The Japanese evacuated WWII. By WWII, I'm talking about the 6 main airfields. So the 6 main airfields at WWII, there were 2 at Hansa Bay, there was 1 at Madang and 2 at Alexiushafen. So they just moved out of the whole area because they'd been bombed to death. And now I want to come to the death of Neil Kirby, and this is one of the saddest things in the history of 5th Air Force. You'll recall me saying Kirby made these rules of engagement which all but ensured the survival of any Thunderbolt pilot in combat. And he told his pilots, he would literally shout at them, "You do not break these rules." So on March the 5th, 1944, he broke his own rules. And here's what happened. Now, there's a lot been written on this loss, and a lot of it is wrong. It's plain wrong, including the location of where Kirby crashed. We know where he crashed because the wreckage is there and it's identifiable, and the actual fin from his wreck now is in the National Museum in Dayton, Ohio. So I know exactly where he crashed, and it's not the place that's mentioned in any of the history books, by the way. But here's the other side. So I've also been able to obtain the history of the 77th Air Regiment, and the 2 patterns line up perfectly on time of engagement and everything. So we know who it was. It's a rare incidence where you can say, hand on heart, I know these are the right 2 pilots. In most cases, you can say, yeah, it's 90% probability, or this is pretty good, it's probably this guy. In this case, we've got this right. Now, here's a curious thing. The unit which Kirby was shot down by was the 77th Air Regiment. They had just moved down from Burma. So their aircrew, their pilots were fresh. It was part of Tokyo's authorization to bolster WWII as a last-ditch stand. So two fighter regiments came down from Burma, the 77th and 33rd. They They came down from Burma, transiting Singapore. They ferried their KI-43-2s, which, by the way, were the latest version and had all sorts of extra stuff, including extra armament, extra weaponry. They were pretty formidable aircraft. They overnighted. They staged via Palembang, Surabaya, Makassar, Namlia, and Halmahera. They arrived in Wewak on the 29th of February, and then followed by a fresh new shipment from the Manila Air Depot, which is, by the way, where all the aircraft were assembled. So the 77th brought with it what they called the Nachiki model, which was an improved variant, and it had improved armor plating, and it also had armor protecting in its fuel tanks. So you'll read that no Japanese fighters had armored protection in the fuel tanks. Well, this is wrong. As of end of 43, a lot of these later models did. So here's what happened. Kirby and his wingmen, he picked two. Sam Blair and Dunham, his two wingmen. So you've got a trio of excellence over Wewak. They entered airspace, 22,000 feet. They're poised to do what they have always done, which is a quick kill and to get away. And below them in the circuit area over Dagoa, which was called But East by the Japanese, not But, it's spelled B-U-T. In katakana, it's pronounced But. So these are reported in all the history books as being Nell bombers. Well, they're not Nell bombers. The Japanese Navy did not operate into Wewak at any stage, unless you go back to February 43. So these, in fact, were KI-48s or Lily bombers. They were operated by the 208th Air Regiment. And I've got the names of their crew, by the way. They were out to sea on a downwind leg. For those of you who are pilots, you know what a downwind leg is. So downward leg, probably around 1,000 feet AGL. It's pretty low. They were unescorted. They were low, they were slow. Gear down, flaps down. They're sitting ducks. And that's what happened. So Kirby and his two wingmen drove through them and took all three down. And we know that as a fact. They're listed. Quite often you don't believe claims or you have to assess them, but these aircraft were lost and they're listed in the Air Regiment records as having been shot down. Now, here's the key thing. So 5 Oscar fighters now scramble from Dagoa in 2 separate flights. The first was led by the commanding officer, the regimental commander. His name is Matsumoto Kunio. So Matsumoto was a very accomplished and experienced Burma pilot, a lot of combat experience. But at this stage of the war, the Japanese are losing pilots left, right, and centre, and the hardest thing for them is not to get new airframes, it's to get combat experienced pilots. When the Air Army first operated in New Guinea, the average pilot experience level was 1,000 hours. So both these guys on his wing, they're kids. One is 19 years old, he's got 200 hours. His name is Mitoma Kyochi. No, sorry, wrong name. That was the next flight. I'll come to that in a minute. So anyway, so this leading trio, led by Major Matsumoto, they take off to engage the intruders. Now, bear in mind, what's happened here is that they've just, Kirby and his trio has just driven through these bombers. After Kirby completed the kills on these Lily bombers, he broke every rule in the book. One of these Oscars came into his sights and he turned to fire at it. He's now low and he's slow. His wingman saw that over here's another Oscar moving in to attack him, so he moved away to break him off. This was Bill Dunham, and he claimed he shot this guy down, but he didn't. So we're not sure why, but anyway. So Kirby suddenly changed course. So he not only is he under attack, he's again changing course. He's not climbing to get away, he's changing course. We don't know what his thinking was, but it's most likely he was just doing a low, slow turn to check on the bombers he'd shot down into the water. Maybe he wanted to see that there was wreckage there, because if he can confirm that, he gets an official kill. And bear in mind, he's now competing with Dick Bong. So at this stage, Kirby turns and another Oscar comes in and hits him. So Kirby's Thunderbolt spun left, and drove into the jungle. So the guy who shot down Kirby, like I said, he's a 19-year-old kid, 200 hours. He's just out of flight school. So this was a lucky shot. You call it talent, call it skill, call it luck, call it what you want. The point is, he was a 19-year-old kid with 200 hours. This was, I don't know if it was his first mission, but it was pretty close to it, because he just joined the unit from in Singapore, not in Burma. So he wasn't a combat veteran. His name is, he was a sergeant, Aogi Hiroshi. So he was ranked a novice, just arrived in theatre, barely 200 hours flying time. So for years and years and years, there's history books writing about where Kirby's Thunderbolt is and so forth. What happened is it crashed in the hills just behind Dagua, but no one found it until 1946. And they found Kirby, his corpse, strung in a bloody parachute from a tree. So he'd bailed out. He'd managed to bail out just before his Thunderbolt went in. So was he injured? We don't know. The wreckage lies at 1,800 feet behind Dagua. It's still there, except for the white fin with the discernible serial number 222668, which is the Kirby's Thunderbolt. And the fin now lies, it's on display in the National Museum in Dayton, Ohio. So, ladies and gentlemen, the moral of tonight's lecture is, if you make a rule book, don't break your own rules. Thank you very much.